ॐ तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः
All
प्रचोदयात्
right, welcome back.
ॐ
So, the focus of our discussion in this
आपोज्योतिः
entire unit, basically, is going to be one particular text, the Samhita portion of the Rigveda. Now, if you remember, this is the core collection of mantras, hymns of praise to the different deities of the ancient Vedic religious world. Now, basically, we'll be looking at kind of like one little corner of that huge Vedic library we talked about, and we're not really going to talk about all the other Vedas or any of the Brahmana or Upanishad texts. A lot of those actually have very different visions of mythology and different attitudes towards the gods and demons that all make up the Rig Veda. So, it'll be really important to keep this distinction in mind, keep this idea in mind as we're looking at all of the myths in this unit. They're coming from a very particular period, time, and place, the early Vedic period around 1500 to 1000 BC, and from one text in particular, the Rigveda Samhita. So, what is this text that we're talking about? The Samhita of the Rigveda is made up of 1028 hymns to the deities. These would be like distinct songs in a songbook. You can think of it that way, maybe. Each of the Rigveda hymns contains a number of verses within it, and each verse is called a ruch. That's where the name Rigveda comes from. It's the Veda of the ruches, the knowledge of the verses. The Rigveda was most probably composed somewhere between 1500 to 1000 BC, which we can call this early Vedic period. As Stephanie Jameson and Joel Brereton explain in their introduction to their translation, which you should read, we can make this dating because basically the Rigveda does not mention iron at all. But the very next Veda that was composed, the Atharva Veda, does mention iron. And since iron starts to appear in the archaeological record in India around 1000 BC, kind of gives us a nice milepost, right? We can say that the Rigveda Samhita was before 1000 BC. Another thing to note is that the hymns we're looking at are not the very first time that the stories have been told. The hymns of the Rigveda actually reflect a really, really ancient Indo-European tradition of praise poetry to the gods. These sort of poems can be found in ancient Celtic cultures in Ireland, in Old Greek culture, Norse culture, Persian, and a bunch of other places as well. So the idea is that the Rigveda's hymns, these praise poems, are kind of an Indian inflection of a much, much older Indo-European tradition from a far more ancient prehistoric past that whoever these Aryans were, they must have carried with them when they settled in India. In fact, the Rigveda's mythology and ritual tradition is kind of closely mirrored right next door by the ancient culture of India's neighbor, Iran. The old Persian Avesta and the religious culture of Zoroastrianism have a lot of features that are unquestionably related to Vedic culture. And so we can say that Avestan and Vedic culture once would have belonged to a common religious tradition that we can call Indo-Iranian. The Rigveda itself seems to have been compiled for the purpose of performing early Vedic Soma sacrifices around 1200 to 1000 BC. And as such, it reflects kind of one elite Brahminical perspective on early religion and culture of the time. There probably were, most certainly were, other competing religious practices, lifestyles, religions, even in that early Vedic period that we just can't get a good sense about from this one text. There are probably also non-Vedic traditions, non-elite traditions in North India at that time that just didn't survive. Now, what can we say about the hymns of the Rigveda? For each hymn, we're told who its original seer was, its rishi, who had first kind of plucked the poem out of the ether and concretized it into the utterances that we find today. Each hymn is also dedicated to at least one god or goddess, the one that's the target of the praise. The basic goal of each hymn is to impress that target deity, invite them to the Soma party we're having, and make them feel good about our relationship with them, the human relationship to the gods. Then, hopefully, we humans might get we might get these gods to give us something. The hymns of the Rigveda are poems of praise to the gods. They praise their wondrous character, abilities, power, uh, and they celebrate all of the gods and goddesses and their remarkable achievements. But the poets also demand something in return for all this flattery and for the food and drink that they're providing. The poets, for their patrons and also for themselves, the poets ask for good health, long life, offspring, lots of cattle, prosperity, success in war, good fortune, all sorts of other good things. So it's important to note that there was a kind of sense of reciprocity in this early Vedic culture. I do something for you, you do something for me. This reciprocity is going to disappear in the later culture. Now, while they praise the various deeds of the gods, the hymns don't tell complete narratives about these myths. They're not stories, they're poems. They're not storytelling sessions. They make oblique references, they give fragmentary accounts of all the various deeds of Indra, Agni, Surya, and so on. But they don't just like sit there and tell you the whole story from the beginning to the end. After all, everyone in the audience and also the gods themselves, they already know of these stories, right? They would have already known these stories in that time and place. I always like analogies when I'm thinking about the ancient past. So let me give you another one that kind of fits this situation. If you're up for it, let's think another time. Let's go back to thinking about hip hop, right? And Jay-Z's song Empire State of Mind. You know that one, right? Every line in that song is an allusion to different things that he's either done or that have happened in New York City. So when he says, "Catch me at the X with OG at the Yankee game," we of course know that he's talking about going to see a baseball game in the Bronx with his friend Juan OG Perez, right? And when he says, "3 dice CeeLo, 3-card Monty," this is a reference to gambling games that he's played on the streets. And finally, when Jay-Z says, "Statue of Liberty, long live the World Trade," we all know that he's talking about what happened on 9/11. But think about it. If someone happens to read this poem 4,000 years from now and doesn't know anything else about history, there's no way they could know the full story of what happened on 9/11 just from this line, or about baseball, or playing dice on the streets of New York. All of the slang terms refer to so many, there's so many other things that these slang terms refer to. OG, CeeLo, Monty, X, right? How are we going to know exactly what he's talking about if we're living thousands of years into the future? This is the kind of situation I think we have when we're looking at the hymns of the Rigveda. Right? They're like tiny shards of larger myths that we have to sort of piece together thousands of years later to figure out what the bigger myths were without any other texts or any guidelines to help us do it. That's what makes Vedic studies so fun, actually. It's kind of like a massive, massive detective game. Now, if the poets who composed the hymns aren't just telling stories, what are they trying to do? Remember, these hymns are poetry. And like all poetry, they deal in metaphor. Metaphor is what draws two concepts or spheres of thought together and juxtaposes them. The connective tissue or glue in Vedic poetry that does all of this is a concept called ruta, or truth. The idea is that a hymn, a poem, connects the reality of the gods, the other world, to the reality of our world. Ritually chanting the hymns, the mantras, ensures that the gods and the feats that they've accomplished remain real and present in our world. It's this truth that empowers the Vedic mantras with the force of Brahman that we talked about last time, that efficacious power that animates the entire universe. There's a connection between truth, Ruta, and Brahman. And that's the real cultural value behind the Veda, The reason why those Brahmin priests that we looked at last time have taken such great care to preserve them orally and exactly in their memories. Something to think about for a second. The way that we use the word myth in our lives today, we use it like to mean a false story, right? Fake news in a way, right? A myth is something that's fundamentally wrong or untrue. But Vedic myths, as captured in the Rigveda's mantras, were thought to be infused with a certain essential truth force that basically glued or anchored the gods and their deeds to the reality of our world. Myths in a traditional society are actually more powerful than ordinary stories or even just facts because they have a different kind of truth force that empowers them. And that force is what's important. Only the most inspired poets had access to this truth force, and this happened through something internal, their own personal insights or inspiration. Pratibha is the Sanskrit word for this. It wasn't something you could be trained in, and this is the important thing to keep in mind as a key difference between this early Vedic period and the later Vedic period. In the time from 1500 to 1000 BC, different tribes would have had their own families of inspired Vedic poets who would come up with or see new Rigveda hymns during each sacrificial session. After 1000 BC, though, the priests in the tribes learned exactly the same fixed set of mantras that were found in the Rigveda Samhita. No new mantras are created after that. Okay, so with this kind of broad view of the Rigveda and its hymns and the mythology that's captured in it, let's now take a little break. We'll come right back, and in our next segment, we'll look at the Vedic pantheon and the different gods and goddesses that get worshipped or praised in the Rigveda.